Have you ever been forgotten in your own family, left out at a time when you thought you'd finally be seen? At Christmas dinner, while everyone else received gifts, I was left with nothing until I unwrapped a secret they never saw coming. My name is Clara Lawson, and I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho, where the mornings are still and the world seems to move at its own quiet pace. The hum of the heater, the occasional chirp of birds outside, and the rustling of trees in the wind are the sounds that fill my days. I've grown to appreciate the solitude, but it wasn't always this way. Before Frank, my husband, passed away 3 years ago, the house was filled with noise, the sound of his footsteps, the laughter we shared, and the constant flow of visitors. Frank was a builder, a man who could fix anything. Whether it was a leaking faucet or a broken heart, he knew how to make it better. He had a way of making everyone feel welcome, a way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the room. Losing him was like losing the center of my world. I struggled with silence, with empty rooms that used to be so full. In those early months after his death, I barely left the house. I didn't know how to be alone, but eventually I began to rebuild my life in small ways. Morning walks, simple meals, and a return to my favorite books. I created a routine that felt familiar, a rhythm that kept me moving forward. But there was always something missing, something that never quite felt whole. My son Ben had always been my connection to the world outside. We used to talk about everything: life, love, the future. But over time, something shifted. The calls became less frequent. The visits stopped altogether. At first, I thought it was just a phase, but as the months passed, I realized that the distance between us had grown wider. Ben and his wife, Emily, had their own life now. It wasn't that they didn't care, but it felt like they didn't need me anymore. I wasn't part of their plans, not like I used to be, and that hurt. But the quiet became my companion, and I found ways to make peace with it. Before I continue, I want to ask all of you to please give a like to this video and subscribe to my channel, The Silent Stories, for more stories like mine. Your support means the world to me. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment telling me which country you're tuning in from. It's incredible to see how far this community of wonderful people has grown, and I'm so grateful to be able to share my story with you. It was a cold December morning when the phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table sipping my coffee when I noticed the caller ID flash across the screen: Emily. My first instinct was to let it ring. After all, it had been months since I last heard from her, and even longer since I'd had a real conversation with Ben. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe in some quiet part of me, I was hoping for something, a sign perhaps that things could change. I picked up the phone on the third ring. "Hello, Clara." Emily's voice was warm, but there was something strained beneath it. "It's Emily." I blinked, surprised. I hadn't expected to hear from her, not after all this time. "Oh, Emily, it's you. How are you?" I managed to say, my voice steady despite the unexpectedness of it all. "We're doing well, but I wanted to ask you something," she said quickly, almost nervously. "Ben and I were talking, and we'd really love for you to join us for Christmas this year. The kids have been asking about you, and, well, we think it's time to have you with us again." I sat back in my chair, my hand freezing mid-sip of coffee. "Christmas?" I asked, as if the word itself was foreign to me. It had been so long since I'd been included in their celebrations. The thought of spending another holiday alone, waiting for calls that never came, stung. And yet, here was Emily extending an invitation that felt like it was coming from a place of obligation more than warmth. "It's been a while, I know," she continued, "but we'd really love to have you, Clara. It's time." I felt a strange, unfamiliar twist in my chest. It wasn't that I didn't want to go. Part of me longed to be around them again, to feel like I mattered, but another part of me felt uneasy, like this sudden invitation came with strings attached. Still, I couldn't say no. After all, it was Christmas, and maybe this was my chance to bridge the gap that had grown between us. "I'll think about it," I said slowly, "but I'd love to see the kids again." Emily's voice lightened, and she sounded relieved. "Great. We'll see you then." I hung up the phone, sitting in silence for a moment. They hadn't forgotten me after all. But why now? And what was really behind this sudden change of heart? I sat there for a long while after the phone call, the weight of the invitation sinking in. Christmas at Ben and Emily's house, it felt strange, like a chapter I had long closed being cracked open again. I glanced out the window at the snow drifting lazily from the sky, the world outside as quiet as it always was. The stillness that had settled into my life in the years since Frank's passing felt almost comforting now, like a blanket that kept me warm through the colder moments. But I knew deep down that this quiet had come at a price. It wasn't just the physical distance, though that had certainly grown too. It was the emotional space that had stretched between us, slow and unnoticed at first. Like the way a leaf drifts farther from the branch until you realize it's already fallen. I thought back to the last time I saw Ben and Emily at Christmas 4 years ago. I had baked pies, 3 of them, because I wanted everyone to have their favorites. I remember the way Emily had glanced at me from the kitchen while Ben quietly nodded, as if agreeing to whatever she had whispered in his ear. It wasn't the first time I'd felt the sting of their coldness, but it was the first time it was so clearly on display. I watched as they passed gifts around, the children laughing, their eyes sparkling as they tore into wrapping paper. And then it happened. They handed out presents one by one. A toy set for Thomas, a new sweater for Emily's sister. But when it came to me, there was nothing, not even a glance in my direction, not a word, not even a card. I sat there trying to smile, but the sting in my chest was sharp. Ben didn't even notice. Emily didn't either. I had become invisible in their eyes. That night I left without saying goodbye. I remember the snow falling softly outside as I drove home, my heart heavy and my eyes dry. I couldn't force myself into a place where I wasn't wanted anymore. And yet here I was about to accept an invitation I never expected. I couldn't help but wonder, had they missed me? Had they finally realized I wasn't the inconvenience they once made me feel like? Or was this just a fleeting moment of politeness, a token gesture? The question lingered as I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself another cup of coffee. It felt strange to even consider going, but as the minutes ticked by, something else bubbled up inside me. I wasn't the same person who had left their house that night. I had changed. I had learned to stand on my own, to fill the silence with my own voice, to build something that mattered. It didn't need their validation anymore. But this Christmas, maybe I would show them. Maybe this time I wouldn't be the one waiting for a seat at their table. The drive to Ben and Emily's house took longer than I expected. The roads were slick with ice, and the snowflakes kept falling, soft and steady, as if they were trying to blanket the world in peace. I thought about the years that had passed since I'd been part of their Christmas celebrations. I thought about the quiet dinners, the phone calls that never came, and the ache that came with feeling like I didn't belong in the life I had helped create. When I arrived at their house, it looked just as I remembered, large, elegant, the kind of place that felt more like a showroom than a home. There were 2 SUVs in the driveway, one of them with new dealer plates still on it. I parked and sat there for a moment, gathering myself. I hadn't felt this nervous in years. Not since the last time I'd stepped into their world. I grabbed the basket of carefully wrapped gifts from the passenger seat, the ones I'd picked out with such thought. A leather-bound journal for Ben, something I knew he'd appreciate. A kitchen gadget for Emily, something simple but useful. And for the kids, small toys, a stuffed animal, and a book I knew would interest them. They weren't expensive, but I wanted them to know that I still cared. Even after all this time, I still cared. When I rang the doorbell, it opened almost immediately. There stood Emily, her smile tight and polite, not quite reaching her eyes. "Clara," she said, her voice as cheerful as always, but there was an edge to it. "You made it." She stepped aside to let me in, and the warmth of the house hit me immediately, along with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Everything was decorated meticulously, white lights on the tree, elegant decorations, and that familiar feeling of perfection that always surrounded them. Ben appeared a moment later, his phone in hand, his thumb scrolling through something on the screen. He gave me a quick hug, one-armed, the kind of hug you give someone when you're not sure if you're happy to see them or not. "Glad you made it, Mom," he said distractedly, his attention still on his phone. I smiled, but it didn't reach my heart. The kids were already in the living room, their faces buried in their screens. They barely acknowledged me, just a quick hey as they continued scrolling through whatever kept their attention. "Let me show you to your room," Emily said quickly, a little too quickly. She led me upstairs to the guest room, which was small, the bedding faded and the room colder than I expected. The dresser had a thin layer of dust and the light flickered when I turned it on. It was far from the cozy, welcoming rooms I had once decorated for guests in my own home. "If you need anything, just let me know," Emily added, already standing in the doorway, as if she couldn't wait to leave. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking her for. I set my gifts down in the corner of the room, unpacked my suitcase, and then sat on the edge of the bed. I let the silence settle around me. I hadn't expected much, but I certainly hadn't expected to feel so small. I hadn't been here in so long. But the old feelings came rushing back. The feeling of being on the outside looking in. But this time something was different. This time I wasn't the same woman I had been when I left. And this Christmas I wouldn't let them forget it. Dinner was served in the dining room, and I made my way downstairs to join the family. The table was set perfectly as expected, a pristine white tablecloth, elegant place settings, and a centerpiece that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Emily's voice floated through the air as she greeted everyone, her tone always just a little too bright. The kids were already seated, their eyes glued to their phones, and Ben was talking about some new app he had downloaded, his voice full of excitement, but his focus still on the screen. Emily had prepared a fancy meal, roast turkey, roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and a salad that seemed more decorative than edible. There was wine, of course, and sparkling water for the kids. I was the last to sit, placed at the far end of the table, a seat that felt almost intentionally distant from the others. The gap between me and the rest of the family seemed to widen with every minute that passed. I tried to make conversation, but it was like trying to speak to a room full of people who were half listening. Ben and Emily talked about work, about the kids' latest accomplishments. Their voices bounced off the walls, filled with stories of their busy lives, but no one seemed to notice the quiet at my end of the table. I took small bites of my food, grateful for the quiet hum of conversation, but even the food felt distant. I wasn't really part of the moment. I couldn't help but notice the way the kids barely looked up from their screens, the way Emily gave me a quick smile before turning back to her husband. She would occasionally glance at me, but it always felt like she was seeing through me, as if I wasn't really there. Ben didn't speak much, his attention flickering between his phone and the conversation at the table. It was like I was an extra at this dinner, a guest who didn't quite belong. At one point, Emily asked, "So Clara, how's life? Still doing your hobbies?" The way she said hobbies made it sound more like a polite dismissal than a real question. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth, trying to gauge whether she genuinely cared, or if this was just another way to keep me at arm's length. "Some things," I said quietly, keeping my tone neutral. "You know, writing, reading." She nodded, her smile still as fixed as it had been when I walked in. "That's nice." And just like that, the conversation shifted back to whatever new app Ben was excited about. My heart sank. I hadn't expected them to roll out the red carpet for me, but I also hadn't expected to feel so invisible. The room filled with laughter, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that made you feel included. It was the kind that made you feel like you were sitting in a room full of people who had already made up their minds about you. I looked around the table, at the piles of food, at the glistening wine glasses, at the gifts piled high under the tree that I hadn't been asked to help decorate. And then I looked at the empty space beside me. That was the one thing that no one could take from me. My presence. I might have been left out of everything else, but I still had myself, and this time I wasn't going to sit quietly waiting for an invitation that might never come. As the meal came to an end, the table began to clear. The conversation continued, light and casual, as if nothing had changed. Emily started clearing the plates, making her usual rounds, and Ben checked his phone one last time before putting it down. The kids wandered off to the living room, presumably to resume their distractions, leaving me to sit alone at the end of the table. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken things, a distance so palpable I could almost touch it. But as I sat there, I knew it was time to break the silence. I wasn't going to leave this dinner, this family gathering, feeling small and invisible anymore. I had something to show them, something they didn't know about me, something they would never have guessed, no matter how much they thought they understood my life. I reached down into my handbag, pulling out the small envelope I had packed earlier. It wasn't flashy, just a simple white envelope with a few papers inside. I didn't need anything grand. I just needed them to see. The room was still buzzing with casual chatter when I gently placed the envelope on the coffee table. I didn't say anything right away. I simply set it down, watching as Emily glanced at it first, then Ben, who paused mid-sentence. Their eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me. A moment of silence passed, one that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. "Well, what's this?" Ben finally asked, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. I took a deep breath. "It's something I've been working on," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. "Something I built, quietly, over the last few years." Emily raised an eyebrow, her polite smile faltering slightly. "Oh?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "What kind of project?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I gestured for Ben to take the envelope. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up. His fingers brushed over the paper, and he pulled it out carefully. I could see his eyes skimming the first page, a slow shift in his expression as he processed what he was reading. "It's a blog," I said quietly. "I started it a while back. It's called Second Wind Stories. I write about life, aging, and things that most people don't talk about. Things that are important, especially to women who feel like they're fading into the background." I paused, letting my words hang in the air. The weight of them wasn't lost on me. Ben glanced up at me, the shock on his face evident. "Wait, you've been doing this by yourself?" he asked, his voice softening. "Yeah," I said with a small nod. "I started writing, then I learned how to build an online presence. I created a store. I even started selling products, journals, ebooks, things that help people like me, people who have been overlooked." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged with something new. Ben flipped through the pages of the report, and I could see him stopping at the numbers. He squinted, reading the figures in disbelief. "Last quarter, you made over $38,000, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, like he wasn't sure if he was reading it right. "That's right," I said calmly, my gaze steady. "I built it on my own, without anyone's help, and I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I needed to." Emily stood quietly in the background, her face expressionless, but I could tell the gears were turning in her mind. She hadn't expected this. No one had. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle in. I hadn't come here to impress them. I hadn't come here to ask for approval. I had come because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one waiting to be seen. This time they were seeing me. Ben's voice broke the silence. "I had no idea," he murmured, still processing the reality of what I had built. "Well, Ben," I said softly, "I've been building my life again, quietly, without anyone's permission. And now I think it's time you knew what I've been up to." The silence lingered in the room as Ben slowly placed the report back on the table. I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman who had always been quietly present in the background of his life with the one sitting before him, now strong, steady, and quietly powerful in ways he hadn't expected. I watched as he glanced at Emily, who still hadn't said much. Her arms were crossed, her lips pressed into a tight line. The tension between them was palpable, but I didn't let it shake me. This was my moment, the moment when they could finally see what I had built for myself, and the moment I stopped waiting for their approval. Ben broke the silence. I had no idea you were doing this, he said, his voice still tinged with disbelief. You made all this yourself? From scratch? Yes, I replied calmly, sitting back in my chair. It wasn't easy, but I learned everything I could. SEO, building an email list, how to write posts that attract readers. It's not about getting rich. It's about making something that matters, something that feels real. Emily shifted her weight, finally breaking her silence. You've been running this blog for how long? She asked, though her tone sounded more calculating than curious. About 2 years now, I said, a hint of pride slipping into my voice. And it's not just a blog anymore. I've expanded, started selling journals, ebooks, and even printable planners. I've sold thousands of products. The blog's grown to over 80,000 readers, mostly women in their 60s and 70s who are looking for something real, something they can connect to. I paused, letting the numbers sink in. The disbelief on Ben's face was slowly giving way to a mix of awe and something I couldn't quite place. But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was the quiet determination that had gotten me here. The work I'd done in silence, without their help, without anyone's recognition. I watched as Ben turned back to the report, his eyes skimming the figures. This is incredible, he said, more to himself than to me. I didn't know. You didn't know. Because I didn't tell you. I replied, my tone soft but firm. I didn't tell you because every time I tried, it was always dismissed. Every time I showed up with something I thought mattered, there was always an excuse, a reason to shut me out. So I stopped asking. I stopped waiting. Emily's eyes flickered over the pages. And now, she asked, her voice still a little too sharp. You're telling us because. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. I'm telling you because you've asked. You've invited me here, into your world. But this, I gestured to the report on the table. This is my world now. I've built something on my own. And for the first time in years, I don't need anyone's approval to feel good about it. Ben's mouth opened, then closed again. He seemed to be processing something, trying to reconcile the woman who had once felt small and invisible in their eyes, with the one standing before him now, confident and self-sufficient. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen, not because they were impressed by what I had done, but because they had finally understood that I had done it for myself, and that was enough. The room felt different now, quieter, as though the air itself had changed. Emily sat back in her chair, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on the report in front of her. Ben's expression was harder to read, a mixture of shock and perhaps a touch of guilt that I hadn't shared this part of myself with them sooner. The kids had returned to the living room, their chatter rising in the background, but they too seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The laughter had died down, replaced by an uneasy stillness that made the room feel smaller. For a moment, no one spoke. I could see Emily's mind working, her gaze flicking back to the report, to the numbers. The silence stretched on, the weight of the revelation still hanging over us. I knew they were trying to make sense of what I had just shared. The woman they had once overlooked, the one they had never taken seriously, had built an empire from scratch. Ben finally broke the silence, his voice softer now, more thoughtful than it had been before. Mom, I don't know what to say. He leaned forward, rubbing his face with his hand. I had no idea. I smiled a little, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile that came from a place of quiet peace, the kind that comes when you realize that for the first time you don't need anyone's approval to feel valid. It's okay, I said, my tone steady but calm. I didn't expect you to. I didn't do this for you. I did it for me, for the woman I used to be and the one I wanted to become. Emily shifted in her seat, the tension in her posture softening just a fraction. She looked at me, her face no longer blank, but thoughtful. You've really built something impressive here, Clara, she said, her voice quieter now, less guarded. It's not easy, what you've done. I can see that now. Ben nodded slowly. This is real, Mom, he added, his voice full of surprise. I guess I never really saw you as someone who could do something like this. I thought you were just what? I asked gently, though I already knew the answer. I could feel it in the way he had looked at me, in the way they both had, like I was a relic from the past, someone to be forgotten. He paused, then said quietly, "I guess I always thought you were just waiting around, waiting for us to come back, waiting for something." I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. For years I had been the one waiting, waiting for their calls, waiting for invitations, waiting for them to see me. But in the silence they had left me in, I had learned how to stop waiting and start living again. I wasn't the woman they remembered. I wasn't the one they had brushed aside and forgotten. I had created something that mattered, something that no one could take from me, and in that moment I realized that this was the gift I had given myself: peace, purpose, and the freedom to stop looking for validation from anyone else. Emily cleared her throat, glancing at Ben before looking back at me. "I think," she began slowly, "I think we missed something along the way. I didn't realize how much you've done, how much you've changed." I could see the cracks in her carefully constructed wall, a faint hint of something like respect creeping in. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let me know they were seeing me for the first time in a long time. The room wasn't quiet anymore. The kids had returned to their gadgets, the buzz of the holiday energy filling the space. But the quiet that had once hung over me like a heavy weight had lifted. There was something new in the air now: respect, maybe, or acknowledgement. Whatever it was, it felt like the first step towards something better. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for their approval, not for their recognition. I had built something real, something lasting, and that was enough. The rest of the evening passed with a strange, almost awkward energy. The weight of what had just been revealed hung in the air like a dense fog, and for the first time that evening, I didn't feel like I was the one being scrutinized. I was no longer the invisible mother or the ignored grandmother. The silence wasn't about me being left out, it was about them trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one they had just seen. Ben didn't say much after our conversation. He kept glancing at me, his thoughts clearly swirling. Emily, too, was quieter than I'd ever seen her. The sharpness in her tone softened, replaced with a kind of introspection. She continued to bustle about the kitchen, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her movements, something I hadn't seen before. She had always been so put together, so perfect, but now the cracks were starting to show. The kids, of course, didn't notice. They were too wrapped up in their own little worlds, tapping away at their devices, the noise of their laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the quiet shift happening around the table. Lacey, my granddaughter, was the only one who seemed to notice the change. She had been watching from the sidelines, her eyes flicking back and forth between me and her parents. At one point, she came over and sat beside me, her eyes wide with curiosity, her hands folded in her lap. "Granny, this is really amazing," she said softly, almost as if she didn't want to draw attention to herself. I smiled at her, my heart warming. "Thank you, sweetheart. It means a lot to me that you think so." Lacey smiled back, but there was something more in her expression, something that said she understood in a way that the adults hadn't. Maybe she always had in her own quiet way. The evening wore on, but the energy in the house was different now. Ben kept looking at me with a mixture of admiration and something else I couldn't quite place. He seemed almost embarrassed by what I had accomplished, like it was something that didn't fit with the image he had of me. Emily's gaze was more distant, her polite smile now tinged with uncertainty. She hadn't expected this. None of them had. I didn't feel the need to explain myself further. They had seen the truth. The woman who had once been content to sit in the background was now in control of her own story, and I wasn't going to waste another moment waiting for their validation. As the night came to a close, the kids went to bed, and Ben and Emily began cleaning up. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt comfortable. I no longer felt the need to fill it with words. I had already said what mattered. Before I left the next morning, I hugged Lacey tightly. "I'm proud of you, Granny," she whispered, her voice full of warmth. "Thank you, my love," I said, holding her just a little longer. "You're the future. Don't ever forget that." The drive back to my cottage felt different from the one I'd taken just a few days earlier. There was a lightness in my chest that I hadn't expected. I'd walked into that house uncertain, unsure of what I was going to find, but I was leaving with something far more valuable than I could have anticipated: peace. I wasn't looking for their approval anymore. I didn't need them to see me, not in the way they once had. For years, I had been the one waiting for recognition, waiting for phone calls that never came, waiting for invitations that were never extended, waiting for a seat at the table that seemed so out of reach. But I had stopped waiting a long time ago. I had built my own table, a table where I didn't need anyone's permission to be included. And when I had finally let them see what I had accomplished, it wasn't for them, it was for me. The miles passed quickly, and I found myself thinking about the Christmas dinner, the awkwardness, the silence, the subtle glances, the way they had shifted when they realized I wasn't just the woman they had once pushed to the sidelines. But now their reaction didn't sting. It didn't hurt like it used to. It didn't matter. I thought about Ben and Emily, how they had tried to re-enter my life with their polite gestures and well-meaning invitations, how they had assumed they could pick up where we left off, without understanding that I had changed, that I had built something from the ground up, all on my own. They didn't get it, not really, and they might never. But that was okay. I didn't need them to. When I got home, I parked my car in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, looking at the small house that had become my sanctuary. It was quiet here, but it was the kind of quiet that made room for everything that mattered. The walls that had once echoed with loneliness now held memories of growth, of lessons learned, and of the steady hum of a life built from resilience. I walked into the house and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I went to my desk and opened my laptop, just as I did every night. The light from the desk lamp spilled across my notebook, and I paused for a moment, letting the stillness of the night settle in. I had learned to embrace the silence. It wasn't a void, it was space. Space to breathe, to create, to exist. I clicked open the draft for my latest post and began typing. I wasn't writing for them anymore. I wasn't writing to be seen or validated. I was writing for me. The title of the post came easily: The Gift I Gave Myself, and for the first time I wasn't waiting for anyone to read it. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet contentment. I fell back into the rhythm of my life with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. My routine was simple: mornings with coffee, afternoons spent writing and working on my blog, evenings where I'd wind down with a good book or a long walk around the neighborhood. There was a gentleness to it all now, a calm that had settled into my bones. The emptiness I once feared had been replaced by space to breathe, room to grow, and time to focus on what truly mattered. The post I'd written on Christmas Eve, the one where I shared my journey with the world, had done more than I could have imagined. It had been shared thousands of times, quoted in newsletters I'd never even subscribed to. And the comments that poured in, they were more than just words of praise. They were messages from women all over the country, sharing their own stories of resilience and reinvention. They understood me in a way that Ben and Emily never could. They saw me, not for the woman I had been, but for the woman I had become. I kept working on my blog, Second Wind Stories, and my Etsy shop. The orders kept coming in. Slowly, steadily, I was building something that felt real, something that was just mine. I had created my own space, and it was thriving. But more than the business success, what meant the most to me were the connections I was making. Every email I received, every comment, every message from a woman who felt like she was just starting to find her voice. It reminded me that I wasn't alone. And that was a gift I never expected. It wasn't long before I started hearing from other women who wanted to do what I was doing, women in their 60s and 70s who, like me, had been overlooked or forgotten, but who were ready to build something for themselves. I started a small mentorship group, teaching them how to create their own blogs, sell products, and navigate the online world. The group was small at first, just 6 women from different parts of the country. We met weekly on Zoom, shared our struggles, celebrated our victories, and learned together. It felt like a full-circle moment, helping others find their own space in the world, just as I had found mine. It was exactly what I needed. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly connected to the world, to a community of women who understood that we weren't invisible. We were powerful and we still had so much to offer. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a producer at a podcast I followed called The Second Start, a show about people over 50 starting new ventures. They wanted me to come on as a guest. I couldn't help but smile as I read the email. A year ago, I would have been thrilled just to get their attention. Now it felt like a natural next step. I accepted the invitation, of course. And when I sat down to record the interview, I realized something important. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was simply telling my story, sharing my journey with the world. And for the first time, I didn't need anyone's approval to know that it mattered. It was a quiet evening in the spring when Lacey came to visit again. This time it wasn't just for a quick hello or a few hours spent in passing. She arrived with a laptop in hand, a notebook, and a bright smile that made my heart swell with pride. She'd grown up so fast, and now here she was, eager to learn from me. "Granny, I want to learn how to do what you did," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about starting my own blog or maybe a business. I just don't know where to start." I smiled at her, the same warmth filling me that I had felt when she was little, asking questions and wanting to know everything about the world. Now she was asking about something else, how to make her own mark, just as I had. "I'm proud of you, Lacey," I said softly. "And you don't have to have all the answers right away. Just start where you are and keep learning." That's what I did, step by step. The most important thing is to believe that you have something to offer, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't. She nodded, her eyes wide with excitement, her fingers already tapping away on her laptop. We spent the next few hours talking about how to structure a blog, how to use social media, how to stay consistent even when things felt overwhelming. I showed her the tools I used, the platforms I trusted, and even a few of my favorite resources. She soaked it all in, her curiosity and drive reminding me of a younger version of myself. Later that evening, we sat on the porch together, sipping tea, watching the sunset. It was a quiet moment, but it was also one of the most fulfilling I'd ever experienced. Watching Lacey, my granddaughter, take the same steps I had taken years ago felt like passing on a piece of my legacy. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just building a business. I was building something that would outlast me. A legacy of independence, resilience, and the belief that it's never too late to start over. I had spent so many years waiting for validation, for recognition, for someone to see me. But now I knew the truth. The only person I needed to see me was myself, and that was enough. As the days passed, I continued to write, to create, to connect with women who were finding their own voices, their own space in the world. My blog kept growing, my business kept thriving, and my connection to the world deepened in ways I hadn't expected. I had built something real, something that mattered, not just to me, but to so many others who were looking for a place to belong. And the best part, I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval or permission. I had finally built my own room, and I was leaving the door wide open for others to join me. As I sit here now, in the quiet of my little cottage, I realize how far I've come. I built something that was all mine, something that started from nothing but the quiet determination to make something of my own. The journey wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and more lessons than I could count. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. I used to think that validation was something I needed from others. I thought that being seen and appreciated was the key to happiness, but now I know the truth. The key to happiness is in finding peace with yourself, in building something that matters, not for anyone else, but for you. I stopped waiting. I stopped needing anyone to tell me I was good enough. I became my own validation. And that was the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. The world is full of second chances, even when it feels like you've missed them. I found mine quietly, in the spaces others overlooked. And now I see the world differently. I see it as a place of endless possibilities, where it's never too late to begin again, to build something new, and to make the most of the time you have. And as I continue to write, to teach, and to share my story, I know that this is just the beginning. I'm no longer waiting for the world to see me. I've already seen myself, and that in the end is enough.